Welcome to Race Matters. I'm your co-host, Jeff Baker, and I'm joined by my co-host, Eddie Carson, the founder of the Race Matters show. And like we do every episode, we're leaning into the nomenclature of exploring race, class, gender, culture, those issues that seem to divide us, but also allow us space to listen, learn, and to bridge our divides.
We're excited to have you here on Race Matters as we do every episode. Race Matters, you're listening to WJOP, Joppa Radio, Newburyport, Massachusetts. Race Matters can be found on SoundCloud, YouTube, my website, ProfessorCarson.com. And we appreciate you leaning in. And like we do every episode, folks, we have a fantastic guest. One of the things we want to think about here is we want to lean into the funk of thinking about American religion, particularly as we think about the cultural wars and the phenomena that are happening here. And Professor Baker and I have a fantastic guest, a leading expert on this topic, and Professor Paul Harvey, who received his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He is a distinguished professor of history and a presidential teaching scholar at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. His research and his teaching really looks at exploring American history, 16th century to the present, with a particular focus on the intersection of race, religion, and the American South. Professor Harvey is the author of numerous books, numerous editorial works as well. One that I recall for a number of years teaching in my class, American Jesus, titled The Color of Christ, the Son of God and the Saga of Race in America. One of the things that this brother does is he really leans into the personification of intersecting elements that explore and challenge us to think about faith, race, and identity. And that's even seen in the fact that he has really put together some great biographical works on Howard Thurman, who himself was a professor at Boston University, who influenced Brother Martin Luther King Jr., a work, of course, that Paul Harvey has published. Professor Harvey, welcome to the fold of Race Matters, my friend.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
We're excited.
I love the Newburyport, Massachusetts. I didn't realize you were there. I got the W.E.B. Du Bois connection there immediately.
Well, it's interesting. Back south of the station, right, is still connected there because I've been back down in Tennessee, and I should have told you that frequently. Professor Jeff Baker and I, we kind of made our sojourn back down south recently, probably about 3-4 months ago, and doing that. And Newburyport is a fantastic town. One of my favorite places on the planet. And of course, I've got to say that too, because if I don't, even my local listeners may be a little upset with everything too. And I have lots of friends and everything. Hey, Paul, tell us just a little, before we delve into really some of the conversations about exploring race and religion here, tell us a little bit about your background, particularly when it comes to your thinking about race, religion, or do you identify as evangelical Christian? How did your sojourn bring you to this particular junction here?
Sure. So I grew up in Northwest Oklahoma, in the panhandle of Oklahoma, which was, when I grew up, pretty much the whitest place on earth, I would say. And I went to Oklahoma Baptist University. I grew up in a Southern Baptist family, so I went to college. My whole family went to this college. It was a liberal arts denominational school. Great, actually, a great place to go. I had a wonderful education there, and it bounced off from there to the University of California, Berkeley. I think I'm the only person from OBU who ever made that jump. Probably, I don't know. Certainly in my day, I was. I spent a number of years. I moved there before graduate school and lived there for a while. And then I went to graduate school, and then I was there a little after, so a total of 10 years. And then I was a postdoctoral fellow at Valparaiso University for a couple of years. And eventually I ended up here in Colorado in '96, where I've been since then at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. And somewhere along the way, I would say I decided no longer to identify as an evangelical. Probably would identify as a Howard Thurman style um, person interested in issues of religion in general, and deeply formed by my Christian faith, but not limited to that. So I would identify with that. So I once gave a talk here to focus on the family, a local,
Oh yeah.
famously conservative evangelical organization, and they asked me to come talk about African American religious history, which I was happy to do. And so afterwards, someone asked me, "Are you a Christian?" And I knew what they meant by that, which is, "Are you an evangelical?" So my answer to that was no. And then I said, unless you define Howard Thurman as a Christian, and in which case I would answer yes. But of course, they would not define Howard Thurman as that, nor would Howard Thurman want to be defined as a Christian as they would have defined that. So that anyway, I kind of fall, I guess, in that category now.
No, and that's fascinating. And I won't speak for Professor Baker here, but one of the things about us is we're both very familiar with Oak. I think so. We attended Harding University
Yeah,
in
I know that
Arkansas,
place.
and
Yep.
I think they may athletically competed against each other. I could be completely wrong.
I think I believe so. Yeah, yeah. I had a very good student years ago from who was a graduate of Harding and was a treasured master student of mine, and in fact worked for Focus on the Family, and we had a great relationship when she was here.
And that's
Yeah, I
interesting.
remember when we were at Harding, we had a little chant that just said "Kill the Baptist" over and over again when we played a Baptist school. It was pretty fun. Harding's in the Church of Christ mode.
Yeah,
We're both expats from that tradition as well, so we share that path.
Well,
yeah.
and
That was much more conservative than Southern Baptist, which is kind of hard to believe, but it is.
I would say so. When you're coming from the tradition of the Church of Christ, the whole idea is if you're not Church of Christ and you're a Baptist, you're already lost.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how you're going to make your way into heaven coming from that heritage foundation that's there too.
Yeah, I will say as a young person, I was quite serious. When I was 15 years old, I went to Brazil as a kind of a volunteer missionary kind of project. Actually, we were in the Amazon region of Brazil. I spent 3 months there, so I was going to be a missionary at that time. That's what I was going to. Anyway, that obviously didn't happen, but that's the kind of world that I came from.
My grandparents were Church of Christ missionaries abroad, and I was in the field at 7, 8, 14, 16 years old along the way,
Mm,
and so
yeah.
appreciate that. You have alluded to something that I think is actually really important, and that's this question of definitions, and who defines them, and I think this is a question of orthodoxy or heterodoxy and heresy sometimes. Uh, but could you please define what you mean right now by evangelical and perhaps describe how you have seen that term in practical common use evolve over the time that you study?
Oh boy, is that a question? So now, historically, it is defined by a certain general set of beliefs, and there's the famous David Bevington quadrilateral, and the belief in personal salvation, the belief in eternal life, the belief in the necessity of conversion, and the belief in the necessity of spreading the word of God. It's kind of that quadrilateral, and so for 18th, 19th, much of the 20th century, that kind of general world would define them. I think since World War II, it has come to have much more of a politicized definition associated with conservative politics, free market capitalism, and so forth. Um, and most recently, of course, has become very much more tied into the culture wars, such that now evangelical immediately tends to signify a politicized definition. Now, we do have one of my favorite books, recent vintage, is by Isaac Sharp, The Other Evangelicals, and that is to say the people who were kind of shoved out of African American evangelicals, gay evangelicals, feminist evangelicals, who were kind of shoved out as the process of, yeah, there you go, as the process of defining evangelicalism got more narrow and more strict. Uh, but that was not an inevitable outcome. That was very much an outcome that was kind of planned and produced. I would say, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, but is very much part of our world today. I regret that, but it happened.
So just a quick follow-up question on that. And I know this is nuanced and it's a complicated question, but in that post-war era, and especially probably beginning in the 70s, moral majority, all of those movements that sort of yielded fruit in the Reagan administration and then on, do you tend to think that the politics came after the church, or did the church come after the politics?
Ooh.
Um, I think that I don't know how to answer that question exactly. That's a difficult one. I think that in some sense there was a um, there was a sense among many evangelicals that they're like when evangelicals now talk about a Christian nation, there was a sense in which they had a world in which there was a kind of a generally prevailing assumption of a kind of Christian foundation to the country, not an alliance between church and state, but more of a kind of informal structure, a kind of informal penumbra that surrounded everything. And then they sensed that it wasn't there anymore, and that freaked them out. And their response to that, I think, has been to engage with politics to try to recreate the kind of Christian penumbra surrounding the idea of America that they sensed had been part of American history. And by the way, they're not wrong about that. It was part of American history. They're perfectly correct about that, particularly in the earlier parts of the 19th century, for example. I'm thinking of David Sahat's The Myth of American Religious Freedom, which talks about the after disestablishment, there was an informal religious establishment which really governed behavior and norms for what was acceptable and what was not for much of the 19th century. And I think contemporary evangelicals of the conservative variety kind of yearn for a recreation of that world in many ways.
It's interesting. I want to add to that, particularly. So, I have two working manuscripts and one under contract right now, but particularly I've delved into the archives quite a bit, exploring and looking at not so much Billy Graham. A lot's been written on Billy Graham, but looking more at his editor during Christianity Today, Carl Henry, and really thinking about Carl Henry, how Carl Henry kind of shaped the ethos of thinking about race and religion. And that's some of the things that you delve into. One of my contentions, or obviously early on, is that Billy Graham and Carl Henry kind of started to redefine how we think about evangelical Christian life. Would you agree with that? Would you say maybe, Eddie, that's a little too simple?
No, Carl Henry especially in the intellectual way defined it, and then Billy Graham kind of popularized that idea. And so you put those two together as a team. I don't know. I think that's absolutely correct.
So then that being the case, then we go from, because I think Carl Henry, he's done with Christianity Today, I don't know, circa 68, 69, roughly around that time. And you start to see what I would call a transition, a different kind of evangelical movement, right? I'm not going to kind of go through line by line of history and all this stuff too. But I remember back when I was a young man back in the 80s, and seeing this evangelical push from people coming to coliseums and asking God to come in, and they would lift weights. Do y'all remember that? And strength and really trying to popularize the message of bringing people in as part of the extension of this mega church element to what we're seeing now, which feels very different. Some people are afraid of the word evangelical. Some people wear it with a sense of pride and a badge on their chest. What has happened between those 1980s periods when we think about that message of evangelicalism and now?
I think there's a much more militant sense and a much more angry sense of a world that is full of demonic spirits. I think, in some sense, the kind of Pentecostal worldview, which has that sense of demonic spirits, has very much found it. By the way, that's very much centered in Colorado Springs with Peter Wagner and all of his proteges. I think they really brought that into evangelical world and brought a sense that there is a war that isn't just about political issues, but is being played out at a broader spiritual level. And like all those guys you saw flying their flags on January 6th, for example, a lot of them were proteges of Peter Wagner.
Mm.
And they really believed in all this stuff about the spiritual warfare. They really believe that. It's not a cynical thing on their part. They're very much imbued with that kind of worldview. That stuff is so much more a part of evangelical culture. It was part of it when I was a young man, 60s and 70s, but it was much more abstract and it wasn't politicized. It was much more about the struggle for your own soul. It wasn't about the struggle for the nation as a whole. I mean, there was a sense that, the nation was sinful and it should be redeemed, but it ultimately came back to the individual. And that now has been, I think, drawn writ large into kind of uh, why it is that when people see political figures who are described in such hyperbolic terms and people can't understand that, I think it's because that kind of language has come into the evangelical world from other kinds of sources and has become part and parcel of it in a way that just wasn't the case prior to the 80s. I like to say, because I grew up in the Southern Baptist Church, I graduated from high school in 1979. I never heard the word abortion one single time when I grew up. Never, not one single time. um, and I didn't even hear it that much in the early 80s. And what I heard was about the fact that you are a sinner and you need salvation and you need to deal with your personal stuff. That's really what evangelicalism was fundamentally about. And the 80s was a big transition period when you saw it begin to be writ large onto society at large. That's when the conservatives began to uh, predominate in the Southern Baptist Convention in a way that they had not before, and definitely took over in the 90s. And so the whole world that I grew up with is just gone, really. It's just so completely different now.
I grew up in a small town in Mississippi, and I had good friends across sort of the spectrum between the Churches of Christ, the Southern Baptists, the Methodists, the Episcopals, Presbyterians of all stripes, and Pentecostals. And it's interesting that those distinctions really still mattered through the 80s and 90s, at least where I grew up, or at least the church in which I grew up.
Hmm.
And those differences seem to not be as theologically meaningful.
No, they don't mean anything at all. Like we used to argue about modes of baptism. Like nobody
Right,
cares about that anymore, right? That's
right,
that's
right.
completely irrelevant. And I would say when I grew up, I was like, I think about the people I grew up with. They were very conservative, of course, but they were not angry at
Right.
anything, and they were not full of conspiracy theories, and they were not spouting conspiracy theories about this and that. And they had a generally not very direct connection to the political world. They kind of saw the political world as full of, they didn't really trust them. And they used to make kind of Will Rogers style jokes about, the politics and whatever, but they didn't take it all that seriously in a way. It's not like today when they're busy spouting their stuff on Facebook and so forth. It's just totally different.
So a follow-up, if you don't mind. We are talking very much, I think it's fair to say, but please correct me if I'm wrong, about white strands of the church
Yeah, yeah,
in the
absolutely,
United
totally,
States.
absolutely, yeah, yeah.
And would you please address your thoughts on the evangelical tradition of the Black church versus the evangelical trajectory that you've just been describing?
Yeah, so of course the question is whether evangelical is a word that African Americans would want to be associated with because it is so connected to a certain politicized white version of Christian nationalism now. But of course, there was a long history of African American Christianity, which had strong evangelical strains and had evangelical theology and had much of the same kind of preaching content of preaching, at least that you saw. So my first book was about white and black Southern Baptists after the Civil War, and one of the things that I found was, um, in terms of like denominational leadership between white and black Southern Baptists, they were saying a lot of the same things, which is our people need to learn how to behave better. They need to learn how to be good citizens. They need to learn to educate themselves. They need to learn how to behave in public. And our job as like Christian leaders is to train people to be good modern citizens. That was a strong theme, kind of the uplift theme among Black evangelicals, and it was an uplift theme among white evangelicals as well. And I was surprised, and I wrote a lot about how interesting it was that how similar their rhetoric was between the white and Black denominational organizations. Um, and of course, the rhetoric of Martin Luther King is full of evangelical rhetoric, and the rhetoric of African American churches down to the present day, Protestant churches is full of evangelical rhetoric. But of course, it has a totally different political valence. So, of course, we all know the well-known book Divided by Faith, which is about how white evangelicals have a completely individualistic interpretation of all this, and African American evangelicals do not. And that's a fundamental divide um, that has never been erased. That's still there.
One of the things I think about here too is, I think about, you're talking about this relationship between a white and a Black church. We get to the 60s, and then that's an interracial, parts of it's interracial in many ways too. But yet, as we move through the 60s, 70s, 80s, we get to the age of Black Lives Matter, where people were saying, maybe the Black church isn't the church it once was. So I'm looking for other movements, right, to kind of coalesce with like-minded people who are looking to think about racial justice, unlike the church of Brother King in the past. And we come to this element where I always think about the fact that the white church is so focused on sin and salvation that they have abandoned and ignored the suffering and the pain of Black folks.
Yep.
Whereas the Black church and Black people, right, are constantly thinking about issues of racial justice and discrimination and exploitation. In a white church, they don't even want to touch this at all. I mean, and again, I don't want to say anything about Professor Baker, who, I'm no longer evangelical Christian, as I identify more as an atheist. Brother Professor Baker, who's abandoned, the churches of Christ for the Episcopal Church, a little bit more enlightened and thinking about this stuff. But that dilemma is there about the consciousness of race.
Mm-hmm. Totally. That's the theme of that Howard Thurman, of course, dealt with, and was bitingly critical of Christianity in America for precisely the reason that you just talked about. Martin Luther King, of course, said much of the same kinds of things. Many other African American evangelicals, many white evangelicals who have been sort of pushed out. Jim Wallace, the sort of liberal evangelical people, have made the same kinds of criticisms, but they are outside the fold now. So the fact that you cannot talk about, in the white evangelical church now, you can't talk about racial justice without being accused of being woke, which is, of course, is a terrible term, and you can't be that. The fact that you can't do that is just appalling, because you could do that. Actually, you could do that even in the Southern Baptist Church. You could do that in the 1960s. In fact, people did it all the time. If you read the minutes of the Southern Baptist conventions, they have a lot to say about racial justice in the 1960s. It doesn't mean that their individual churches were for that. It meant that there were people of conscience who were trying to move the denomination in that direction. They ultimately failed, I would say, but they were there and they were trying like hell to do that. And they do not exist anymore. They're gone. They've been pushed out.
It calls to mind the 19th century evangelical thread of abolitionists outside the South, who were, and even pacifists in my Church of Christ background, there were pacifists in Oklahoma right up till World War I that were deeply committed to pacifism in the Churches of Christ, but just political events overtook them. And one of my friends and heroes, and I believe Ed knows him too, is Dr. Richard Hughes, who's a church historian and for the Churches of Christ, among others. And in his book, Reviving the Ancient Faith, he talks about this switch that happens probably in the late 40s, definitely by the 50s, for sure by the 60s, where the white churches of Christ in the South just sort of rhetorically or theologically decided that the concern needed to be about individual salvation. And our concern now is not going to be social justice or the improvement of a fallen world, but just getting people into heaven, which was, in my opinion, and I think Hughes's opinion too, just an off ramp to be able to avoid the issue when it was very, very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out one other thing, which is who's the evangelical who's been most in the news lately? Douglas Wilson.
Oh
That's
yeah.
who it is, Douglas Wilson. The fact that a person, a complete white supremacist theocrat like that, would be who actively advocates theocracy and the complete subordination of gay people and other, just the fact that someone like that would be the pastor of a church that the Secretary of Defense goes to. Like,
Yes.
this is astonishing to me.
But do you
And I can't even wrap my head around it yet.
but do you feel though this element, particularly here in the 21st century? I mean, we're in the year 2025, and we're about as divided as ever, right? I mean, you probably have to go back decades and decades to really get a sense of the last time tension was high, where this divided, people were afraid for their jobs, censorship, all of those things that are happening. Is it this element where, as you pointed out earlier, the politicalization of religion? Essentially, let me say this a different way. Religion has now become so weaponized that we don't know what it means and what it looks like. This idea that if I'm a minister, I'm in a pulpit, I'm thinking I got to work a little bit harder to convince folks that my church is a safe place, particularly if you're LGBTQ, if you're Black or brown, if you're undocumented. Those are not safe places for a large population of folks these days.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm thinking of a local example of this. So, we in Colorado Springs, the downtown is the historic center of mainstream liberal Protestantism. Always has been since the founding of the city. So you have the Congregational Church, the Presbyterian Church, and these are massive churches right on the main street of downtown Colorado Springs. The Congregational Church flies its Black Lives Matter flag, its Gay Pride flag, and so forth. A block away is the former First Christian Church, which had gone into decline, the Disciples of Christ. It had gone into decline. It couldn't, and it had a big facility. It just couldn't keep it up anymore. So it sold its facility to Woodman Valley Chapel, which is a local uh, MAGA megachurch, a
Mm.
megachurch associated with MAGAism, right? Um, and so just a block away from each other now, in downtown Colorado Springs is literally the symbol for me of the division in the Christian church in America today, in some sense.
This is a good opportunity for me to say that none of us are speaking on behalf of our institutions.
Yes.
I'm speaking only on my own behalf and not the University of Alabama, which I am professionally and morally obligated to say. And I
And
think
I
that's
would echo that too. I think we would agree to that.
yes.
Yeah,
Um,
these are all our personal views and academic views, and not institutional
Academic
views.
views.
Totally.
I appreciate that strong dichotomy that you just suggested about seeing the physical manifestation of this. I'd like to inquire with you about another phenomenon, and it may just only be of interest to me. But for example, in Montgomery, where I used to live, and Eddie's from Montgomery originally, there is the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Southern Poverty Law
Yep.
Center has the Civil Rights Memorial that's been there for
Yep.
several years. Maya Lin designed it, the artist who also did the Vietnam Memorial. On the broad marble that goes across the monument, it says, "Until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." And it attributes that to Martin Luther King Jr. Uh,
Hmm.
it does not attribute it to the book of Amos,
To the Amos,
which
right?
is and Dr. King was quoting Amos.
Yes, of course.
But the Southern Poverty Law Center, and I have great friends there, and I'm you know aligned with them in many ways. But this monument has this poetic prophetic statement from Scripture, but does not attribute it to the Bible. It attributes it to King. And I'm interested, although certainly not expert, in the way that a lot of white liberal progressives have become, and I think this may be a clue for that, have become extremely skeptical of the religious roots, the Christian roots of the civil rights movement, the Christian roots that would have underscored the suffrage movement, the abolitionist movement, all of these things. And that this divide that we're talking about might be attributable to the sort of Christian nationalist domination of white evangelicalism, but also perhaps liberals, progressives, justice-minded folks who are very uncomfortable with using that language.
So I think there's part of it that is skepticism and uncomfortableness, and part of it is they just flat don't know because they didn't grow up with it, or because they haven't they're not like us. They didn't grow up in Boyd, unfortunately, because I love the fact that I grew up with the Bible, uh, and grew up in college. I grew up with the classics of Western literature and Shakespeare and all that. I love that. It's sort of old-fashioned in a way, but it's such a rich source that you can draw from your entire life, and then you build on it and you diversify your sources of knowledge. But it's so when you see that, you know immediately it's from the Book of Amos, for example. And I just think a lot of people don't have that now, and that's unfortunate. So whether and then other people may have it and are just have written off religion as sort of hopelessly sold out to the right, and that is very unfortunate. And part of one of the goals of our Center for the Study of Evangelicalism, in fact, is to present to our local public um, kind of as diverse a view of varieties of people speaking about evangelicalism from every possible vantage point as we possibly can, and get them to hear. So, for example, last summer we had a series of programs on Project 2025. And a local church asked us to do this. In fact, I didn't want to do it. I thought, who's going to come on a summer evening to hear about this policy wonk document? I thought this was going to flop. In fact, 400 people every week came.
Wow, that is great.
And one week, Jeff Scholes and I did it. We had three other people doing it 3 other weeks. And the week that we did it, we were talking about the history and theology of Project 2025. I talked about where their historical views came from. Jeff was talking about the theological formation of the people in the Heritage Foundation who wrote Project 2025 and where they got their theological. And he wasn't criticizing them or judging them. He was just trying to give an explanation of kind of their theological bent. And people were that kind of thing when you're talking to a crowd and you can hear them, like you can hear their minds like rustling, and they were into it, man. It was surprising in a good way. And this crowd was full of what I would call liberal evangelical people, because they would get up and say, how can they say that? Jesus didn't say such and such in the Bible. He said blah, blah, blah. Like they would say typical things that a liberal evangelical would say. And I would try to say, well, the view of these people is not that, but it's this other view, which is the following. I was just trying to explain, what the other kind of view was. But the sort of moderate progressive evangelical crowd was out in force here in Colorado Springs to hear about, because they really wanted to know what this thing was and what to do about it.
But would you say though that liberal evangelical crowd there who are coming to a space and are wrestling with this and in many ways kind of learning, becoming a little bit more enlightened, would you put that population in the same category with someone like, and this is a white evangelical that I really appreciate, someone like Jim Wallace, for example?
It was that sort of crowd who would have, like if Jim Wallace came to town, they would have gone to hear him. Yeah, totally.
So now we're talking about a population here who are receiving this information and wrestling, like you said, with this. But what about the climate and the culture where people have now used their sense of religiosity just to kind of close their minds and shut everything out, right? Do you see us moving, this element of religious polarization that's driving our politics really kind of being more enhanced? Or do you think that there's maybe some type of hope that we'll come back down to earth, break bread, and say, hey, we got to figure this out because things are really spinning out of control, my friend?
I I do think so. I'm kind of an inveterately optimistic person. I just my parents were like that, so I kind of inherited it. So, but here's why. So I could speak all day about divisions and things. I stream on YouTube local churches like the MAGA style churches. I stream them on YouTube to kind of see what they're doing, and it's quite appalling
Yeah.
to watch. But what I also do is I go to local coffee shops, and local coffee shops here, they are full of a young crowd that I refer to as hipster evangelicals. And these are like young people who come from this area and they go to college at Liberty University or someplace like that. And then they come back here and they're doing Bible studies in their coffee shop. But, they're doing Bible studies not to prepare themselves to do spiritual warfare in the MAGA style, but because they actually, I think, they're genuinely concerned about the state of the country. They probably are of a conservative mind politically. They're certainly anti-abortion and so forth, all that kind of stuff. That's fine with me. But I think they are truly concerned about the divisions. And when I hear them talk, it gives me hope, actually. And I see them as a kind of hope for the future. When I stream the stuff on YouTube with the older pastors, I just think, God, we're lost.
Can I pick up that thread because
Yeah.
I share that. I have taught. This is my 20th year of teaching. It's my first year of teaching at a public school at the University of Alabama. My previous schools were Pepperdine, which is a Church of Christ school, and Faulkner, which is a Church of Christ school, and I encountered many law students. I'm a law professor who were evangelical or Church of Christ or coming out of these places that we were talking about, but deeply committed to justice because of their deep grounding in Scripture and
Mhm.
their deep grounding in preaching about Scripture. But what I observed, and this isn't empirical, it's just my observations, is that they very often felt extremely torn and they were attracted to international human rights issues, for instance, human trafficking or modern slavery,
Yep.
because that was a way that they could articulate their deep commitments to justice. But if they turned that attention to the United States, it would be very alienating to their families, to their
Yep.
churches, to their
Yep.
schools where they were coming from. And
Mhm.
they love their families and they love their schools and they love their churches, but they're compelled by justice. But because of this like syncretic politicization of party politics and church, they needed to look outside the country to find a way to articulate that.
Yep.
But like you, it gives me hope because I think it's not a long step to get from being concerned about modern slavery to then being concerned about mass incarceration, for instance. And then once they become critical on those issues, then everything else starts to flow. And I'm not even trying to say I want them to be liberal. I don't even want them to necessarily align with the political movement that I align with, but to be justice minded because of their
Mhm.
faith, I hope would help disconnect that from the sort of extreme nationalist politicization.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of our long-term goals with the center is to get those kind of people together with liberal-minded evangelicals who have their own blind spots sometimes, I think, and can have a sort of a certain rhetoric of the government should do this and the government should do that, and they should hear about the limitations of that, I think, and conservatives are good about pointing out the limitations of that. And that kind of dialogue is, my fondest hope is that we can cultivate that here locally.
I appreciate that work. And, one of the things that Professor Baker and I are trying to do, particularly on this show, in the ways in which we engage in different ways about really trying to close that divide, have those conversations. And it sounds cliche because everyone's saying we need to stop and we need to listen, but no one's really stopping and listening. But yet that campaign, that scholarship, that work you're doing sounds like that's happening. As we're starting to near the end of the show, Professor Harvey, I have a question for you. What are you working on now? What scholarship are you delving into?
Three different things. That's my problem. I got to pick one to finish. So one, I'm writing a book called Religion, Race, and Democracy in American History. It's sort of like a capstone of everything I've done, more or less, for my entire career. So it's starting with um, March on Washington, August 28th, 1963. March on Washington, January 6th, 2021. How did we get from one to the other? I thought about that one day and I thought, wow, I want to write a book about to try to figure out how we do it. But in order to explain that, you got to go back. So this is actually going to be from the Constitution to the present. So I'm working on that. I'm so depressed about the state of the country that I'm finding this difficult to write because it's a dark topic for me right now. If you remember the end of The Color of Christ, it's a very optimistic ending to that book, and I read that now and I think, God, that's a lot has changed in the last 12 years. I don't feel that way anymore. So that's one, and another one is yeah, there you go. Another one is the thing we're doing for the Luce Foundation, which is religion, politics, and culture in Colorado Springs, and the premise of this is Colorado Springs was very polarized, famously polarized in the 1990s. It was kind of the center of the culture wars. And that is not true now. It has, in the time that I have lived here, 30 plus years, it has gone exactly the opposite direction as the rest of the country, which is less and less polarization over time. And people actually get along. So the title of our loose grant was called Living Together, which is the premise was over the last 35 years or so, people who were formerly really bitterly divided have kind of learned to live together in spite of their differences. Uh, and how did that happen? And so we're going to put together a book of essays that deal with all phases of Colorado Springs history, and really from 1871, the founding of the city, to the present. And so Colorado Springs has a long liberal Protestant history. Liberal Protestants were really in control of Colorado Springs from 1871 to World War II. World War II to the 1990s, conservative Protestants take over. And now 1990s to the present, the city has exploded, um, has completely diversified. Lots of gay people moved here. Lots of military people moved here. They come from all over the place, and it's a very diverse city now. So the book is going to kind of cover all of those three things. Third thing I'm doing is called Visions from the Apocalypse, which is a book about the global history of responses to World War II. This is not about the United States. This is about, because I teach a class called Global History of World War II. I love this class. So anyway, I can't write this book until I do these other two. So I won't talk about that right now.
That's a classic problem. Good job.
It is. And Professor Harvey, as we come to the end here of Race Matters, for those who are listening, this is Race Matters. I am here with Professor Jeff Baker and Professor Paul Harvey of the University of Colorado Springs. You're listening to 96.3 Joppa Radio, Newburyport, Massachusetts. Again, you can find this show on YouTube, and SoundCloud. And we appreciate y'all chiming in as we do, and particularly engaging in a thoughtful conversation here among the three of us. One of the things we like to do at the end of every episode, Professor Harvey, is we like to give our guests the last word. It can be about anything on your mind. Right? I'm not an optimistic person, but I am hopeful. I will say that. So whatever that last word is, my friend, you have it.
Why don't you give it to us? And I just have to say, it's a delight to have Paul Harvey on a radio show and ask for the rest of the story. So
let me give you
wrap us up.
page 2 and the rest of the story at the same at the same time. So the last word is, so one of the premises of my book, Religion, Race, and Democracy in American History, is we have periods of reactionary politics and a closing down of possibilities, which is almost always followed by expansionary periods of opening up a possibility. So the 1850s was a very dark period of American history, Fugitive Slave Act and following that, and slavery is just going wild, expanding in the 1850s, Civil War, obviously. Then comes Reconstruction and this great period of possibility of biracial democracy. Okay, 1920s, Ku Klux Klan is exploding, et cetera. And then the Great Depression is very dark, and you have the New Deal, and later on the GI Bill, which builds the foundation really for the middle class after World War II. Same thing with the 1950s, followed by the Civil Rights Movement, 1960s, and so forth. So in spite of my periodic falls into depression now because of the dark state of our national life, I look back at our history and say, if you stick at it, and maintain faith, just as Howard Thurman did. He lived through much worse than we did. Just as Martin Luther King did. He lived through much worse than we did. The period of the realization of a more democratic America will come.
Folks, this is Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson. I'm here with Jeff Baker, my co-host, and we are engaged with Paul Harvey. Until next time, thank you for chiming in.